Today in World Literature, we continue our study of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I begin with an analysis of his Nobel Prize acceptance speech. I then turn to love in the time of the cholera. It is an odd thing, I think, Garcia Marquez's Nobel Prize acceptance speech of 1982. Almost immediately, he begins talking about the political situation in his country. He writes that 20 million Latin American children died in the 1970s before the age of 1. More than have been born in Europe since 1970. He writes that those missing of repression number could be nearly 120,000, which is if no one could account for all the inhabitants of Uppsala. Numerous women arrested while pregnant have given birth in Argentine prisons, yet nobody knows the whereabouts and identity of their children, who are furtively adopted or sent to orphanages by order of the military authorities. Because they tried to change the state of things, nearly 200,000 men and women have died throughout the continent, and over 100,000 have lost their lives in 3 great, small, ill-fated countries of Central America, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala. If this had happened in the United States, he writes, the corresponding figure would be that of 1,600,000 violent deaths in 4 years. Garcia Marquez then says that poets and beggars, musicians and prophets, warriors and scoundrels, all creatures of that unbridled reality, we have had to ask but little of imagination, for our crucial problem has been a lack of conventional means to render our lives believable. To render our lives believable. This, Garcia Marquez writes, my friends, is the crux of our solitude. Clearly, I think we know most about Garcia Marquez from the novel that shook the world, 100 Years of Solitude. And we know in that novel that we've associated it with terms such as magical realism. I think that we see that not only in that novel, but in some of Garcia Marquez's short stories. One that comes to mind immediately is a piece that he wrote called Big Mama's Funeral, a funeral that is held in the kingdom of Macondo, in which Garcia Marquez uses fantasy, exaggeration, magical realism, if you will, to portray the death and funeral of a remarkable 92-year-old matriarch. Certainly, he is at his linguistic purest in this novel. At the very moment of death, Big Mama, who is the patriarch not only of this culture, but perhaps the patriarch of all South American culture, before she dies, she dictates to her notary the list of her invisible estate. Listen to this list. The wealth of the subsoil, the territorial waters, the colors of the flag, national sovereignty, the traditional parties, the rights of man, civil rights, the nation's leadership, the right of appeal, congressional hearings, letters of recommendation, historical records, free elections, beauty queens, transcendental speeches, huge demonstrations, disillusioned young ladies, proper gentlemen, punctilious military men, His Illustrious Eminence, the Supreme Court, goods whose importation was forbidden, liberal ladies, the meat problem, the purity of the language, setting a good example, the free but responsible press, the Athens of South America, public opinion, the lessons of democracy, Christian morality, the shortage of foreign exchange, the rights of asylum, the communist menace, the ship of state, the high cost of living, Republican traditions, the underprivileged classes, statements of political support. She didn't manage to finish, Garcia Marquez writes. The laborious enumeration cut her off at her last breath, drowning in the pandemonium of abstract formulas which, for 2 centuries, had constituted a moral justification of her family's power. Big Mama emitted a loud belch and expired. Upon her death, Garcia Marquez further writes, tomorrow the garbage men will come and sweep up the garbage for her funeral, forever and ever. The short story, it seems to me, is particularly appropriate in understanding something about the passage of time and what Garcia Marquez is doing with the passage of time in his own work. Clearly, Big Mama's Funeral, as is the case of 100 Years of Solitude, is exaggeration. There is, for example, in 100 Years of Solitude, a plague, but it is a plague of insomnia. Women are brought into heaven, both body and soul. there is flying. None of these things happen in the novel I want to talk to you about today. None of these things happen in Love in the Time of Cholera. Love in the Time of Cholera is a much different piece. But we must not forget, I think, in turning to this novel, that Garcia Marquez is always and everywhere, as he was in the Nobel Prize acceptance speech, as he was in 100 Years of Solitude, and as he is in Love in the Time of Cholera, interested, as are many Spanish American and Latin American writers, Caribbean writers, in the idea of the political importance and the political implications of their work. Clearly, Love in the Time of Cholera is about many things, but one thing that we can't forget is that Garcia Marquez, always and everywhere in the piece, links the idea of cholera to the idea of war. For example, in one part toward the end of the novel, Juvenal Urbino, one of the three main characters in the novel, is flying over a patch of land and there are bloated bodies below, dead bodies. One of the passengers in the basket remarks, well, that is because of the cholera. And Juvenal Urbino, looking through the binoculars, says, then it must be a very particular form of cholera, because in this particular form, the individuals are finished off with a shot through the neck. The relationship of cholera and the relationship of death run throughout this novel. What's the novel about? What it's about? What is it about in the first place? Well, here's what happens most particularly. The story takes place between about 1880 and 1930 in a Caribbean seaport, unnamed. As well, perhaps, the spirit of the city, I suppose, is less officially mapped there. Three major characters form, of course, as in all good love stories, a triangle. Florentino Ariza, who is a poet in the piece, dedicated to love and carnal knowledge and the transcendence of carnal limitations through lust. His secular life is with the River Company of the Caribbean. He enters it as a young boy, an illegitimate child, and rises to the head of it in old age. Fermina Daza, who's the love interest, a beautiful adolescent with almond-shaped eyes, we find out, walks with a natural haughtiness. She has a doe's gait. She is described by her father as a mule at some point in her stubbornness. And as well, the third part of the triangle, Dr. Juvenal Urbino, very much the hero of a 19th century novel. He is well-born. He's pretty much a sharp dresser, stuck on himself, but nevertheless, as Thomas Pynchon, himself a novelist, said as a review of this book, as a review of 100 Years of Solitude, stuck on himself, but a terrific catch nonetheless. I think we get some idea, and it's important to understand how authors work. If we look at an interview that Garcia Marquez held in 1988 in the New York Times Book Review, he was being asked what was the genesis of Love in the Time of the Cholera, this great love story. Where did it spring from? And he says, it really sprang from two sources that came together. One was the love affair of my parents, which was identical to that of Fermina Daza and Florentino Ariza in their youth. My father was the telegraph operator in Colombia. He played the violin. She was a pretty girl from a well-to-do family. Her father was opposed because the boy was poor and he was liberal, and that was part of the story of my parents. When she went to school, the letters, the poems, the violin serenades, her trip to the interior with her father, when she tried to make her forget him, the way they communicated by telegram, all that, Garcia Marquez, is authentic. And when she returns, everyone thinks she has forgotten him, that too. It's exactly the way my parents told it. The only difference is my parents married. And as soon as they were married, they were no longer interesting as literary figures. And then Garcia Marquez asks, and the other source? Many years ago in Mexico, he said, I read a story in a newspaper about the death of two old Americans, a man and a woman, who would meet every year in Acapulco, always going to the same hotel, the same restaurants, following the same routine as they had done for 40 years. They were almost 80 years old and kept coming. And then one day, they went out in a boat, and in order to rob them, the boatman murdered them with his oars. Through their death, the story of their secret romance became known. I was fascinated by them. They were each married to other people. I always thought I would write my parents' story, he said, but I didn't know how. One day, though, one of those absolutely incomprehensible things that happens in literary creation, the two stories came together in my mind. I had all the love of the young people from my parents, and from the old couple, I took the love of the old people. Significant then is the idea of the intense autobiography that goes behind this to begin with. In turning to the novel itself, though, I think that we may want to look at some things pretty carefully. And that is, above all, no matter what else this is also a love story. It is a love story in many ways. It is a love story in the themes it deals with. It is a love story in the idea of its narrative, which is in many ways certainly not a straightforward narrative, much like Toni Morrison's Beloved, although not as radically drawn as that. It is a love story in the idea of eroticism. But what keeps it from being a soap opera, I think, is the idea of depth of these characters and depth of the story itself. And that is what we have captured here is not just a particular love story, but, if you will, a symbolic or an archetypal love story, a love story that exists across time and place. Because it's always important to remember that as this piece opens, Florentina Ariza and Juvenal Urbino are young people when they meet, and before that, the love interest between Fermina Dazo and Florentino certainly takes place when these are teenagers, when these are children. So it takes place across time and circumstance, so at the end, when they meet again, they are in their 70s. Let's take a look at how the novel opens. It's significant to know that the novel begins on Pentecost Sunday itself, when Juvenal Urbino is beginning to take a look at suicide that he's been called to. And the suicide, of course, is that of one of his friends. And he's struck by the scent of bitter almonds that always reminded him of the fate of unrequited love. As we move in through the book, we find out that it is on that day itself that Juvenal Urbino is himself going to die. He dies in a most comic way, as you'll remember from reading the novel, in trying to rescue a parrot from a tree and falling off the ladder and in doing so. And, of course, just as you might imagine, who was there at the door during the funeral but Florentina Ariza, who declares his love for her immediately and says he has waited for her all these years, and she shows him the door immediately. At that point, the very first third of the novel is over. Moving to the second third of the novel, we have that part of the story filled in. We find out about the young, youthful romance between Florentino Ariza and Fermina Daza. We find out how she eventually in time lost interest in him and how she came to be courted by and married to Dr. Juvenal Urbino. We find out about the complexities in their married life as it went on. We find out about the long-suffering love of Florentino Ariza as he tries to sort of temper his passion and his love, his unrequited love for Fermina Daza over the period of 50-odd years. And the way that he does that, the way that he does that with different women trying to make up, trying to escape the pain of a lost love. And then that's more or less the middle of the novel. And at the end of the novel, we have it closed off where we return again to the idea that Juvenal Urbino is dead. And upon his death, we find that Fermina Daza and Florentina Ariza are left together on one of the great ferry boats in the river company. And while they are alone at the end, one has to ask the question of how much of a life they have left. Garcia Marquez, I think, in a truly stunning final few pages of this novel, an enormously crystalline and pure piece, has them on board looking at each other, and the captain of the ship looks at Fermina Daza and saw in her eyelashes the first glimmer of wintry frost. Then he looked at Florentino Ariza, his invincible power, his intrepid love. He was overwhelmed by the belated suspicion that it is life more than death that has no limits. And how long do you think we can keep up this goddamn coming and going, he asked. Florentino Ariza had kept his answer ready for 53 years, 7 months, and 11 days. Forever, he said. I think that the novel gives us some hope at the end of this. I think it gives us some hope that even in a very troubled and a very complex political world, that love can endure. And indeed, to use Faulkner's terms, love can indeed prevail. Michael Wood, Princeton professor of English, had written of this book in the New York Review of Books in 1988 this. He wrote, "The heart, home of sentiment and dream and nostalgia, but also of more erratic, unpredictable emotions, the place where life itself can always turn up and surprise us. Love is a name for attractive and disreputable impulses, as well as for the noble enchantments and illusions with which we garnish our insufficiently romantic times. If love were always and only a disease, it could only be because life is. Writers have suggested this, but Garcia Marquez is not one of those writers. And here I think we see Michael Wood pointing out quite clearly the crucial point of the novel, and that it is not a novel that is a sad novel. It's not a novel that is tragic. It is a novel that is complex. It is a novel that is a love story. It is a novel that in its execution is quite different in its stylistic techniques from pieces like 100 Years of Solitude or Big Mama's Funeral. But the point of the novel seems to me to be, after all, that it is not Kafkaesque, or it is not a dark novel. It is, to return back to Thomas Pynchon again, a shining and heartbreaking novel. In contrasting 100 Years of Solitude and Love in the Time of Cholera, one finds, surely, a greater sense of hope in the latter novel. Perhaps this hope is a function of love. Perhaps this love is a kind of new myth, itself a kind of magical realism, in which love is reunited across time and circumstance. What is clear is that Garcia Marquez reflects in his work a clear desire for independence. He desires a commitment from us to free ourselves from colonialism of any kind. In this desire and its expression, he must be viewed as Latin America's most admired novelist.